All right, welcome everyone to the first Prospera podcast. I'm Lonis, I'm head of growth at Prospera. With me, I have Eric, the CEO. Also, we have Tim Urban here, who's one of the most prolific writers, I would say, of any intellectual subjects that you want to read whilst not getting bored. Right, you go to WaitButWhy. I actually was very influenced by WaitButWhy in 2016 when I read about AI from it, and me and many of our friends who then went on to found Lovable and many of the leading AI companies. Initially got so much of their inspiration from those blog posts. So it's a great honor to have you here in Prospera. And I guess this will be a more open-ended conversation, right? We'll not really interview you. It will be more of an open-ended conversation, especially between you and Eric, going into the details of governance, the future of governance, and all of those things. But maybe to start us off, what is your impression been so far? You landed here 2 days ago now?
Yesterday.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been action-packed. Yeah, I mean, I'm blown away because just for me, there's a lot of things. There's first, I'm pretty new to the whole concept of even like I kind of knew what a special economic zone was, but and then kind of knew what a charter city was, but I didn't really understand it, and I didn't understand why. I didn't understand the real potential of them. I thought of it as, it's a way for a place like China to get more kind of foreign investment or whatever. But coming here, so first of all, the island is amazing and beautiful. It's like we're in a tropical paradise here, and there's sloths nearby, which I'm going to go see tomorrow.
There you go.
And it's also quite big because you look in the map and it's like, oh, the island's small, and then you're like, well, Prospera has this tiny part of it,
Right.
So it feels like, oh, this is, but then you get here and it's like it's pretty big,
Yeah.
piece of land here, beautiful giant piece of land, and then the people here are awesome. So far I've just met, it's just a lot of, I think this has filtered for very. Not just smart people, but kind of the early adopter type people that are like that a little bit of risk taker and a lot of ambition and kind of people who like the idea of an experiment and like to. So I feel like it filters a lot of very creative, independent thinking people. So it's been great.
Yeah.
But I think what I did not understand is like what I've now heard, like learned about a little bit from Eric and from Nicholas and some others about just like this is it's a mechanism. This kind of thing can be this. It can, we don't have a world where you can just go and find a new piece of land and start a new country.
Right.
That we had that, but that's over. So you have to. It's harder now. But there are ways. Because countries become very entrenched, and it's hard to change things. There's a lot of old baggage, and you kind of feel like, well, this is it. Which country is the best? Which one should we move to? And I think this is like you can be a little more creative, and this is a way how you could. There's a vision here where I can just picture, I don't know, 30 years from now, and South America is wealthy. Central America, just really this as tech comes. There's giant, these new, fishing villages today are these, Dubai's tomorrow. I can see it, right? I mean, there's so much potential, and this seems like a way to potentially like unlock so much.
Right.
So I'm excited.
That's a great way to frame it. And also on the island, right? I want to hear Eric's story of like why the island was chosen. But something that's interesting with it is that it's basically the size of Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Right. And so Hong Kong has 1.2 million people. The island has 100,000 people. So it has a lot of room to grow. And Prospera's footprint is the size of Monaco, and Monaco has 40,000 people. And so even within our current footprint, we have a lot of size to grow. But yeah, I'm curious to learn more about, I guess, the history of.
Well, yeah, when we were looking, just generally speaking, in Honduras and the best analogies around the world, the Hong Kong example was very relevant because though Hong Kong in and of itself was a tremendous success, it was even bigger success as a catalyst for what then ended up happening on mainland China. It was an example essentially copied for Shenzhen, which is the first special economic zone of its type on the mainland, and then that spread out. But it was critical because you first had to accumulate capital and talent that was within the China hemisphere and area of influence. And it wasn't until the mainland had a second opportunity that all that capital, all that talent was basically pumped up supply of opportunity that could migrate to the mainland, where obviously jobs and economic development happened at a much higher impact. And by analogy, when we started this mission is in partnership with the country of Honduras. And the idea, to your point, Tim, is to not enter into these projects as a conflict against or trying to eradicate the Westphalian nation state per se, but rather working in partnership with as an enabler of lifting people up. So in that partnership with Honduras, defining what we were doing with an analogous success case elsewhere in the world of Hong Kong to Shenzhen and the rest of the mainland, it worked very well, and it's indeed the intention. Roatan, Hong Kong equivalent, and then La Ceiba and Satuye, the Shenzhen equivalent, and then the rest of the country can continue to replicate these enhanced special economic zones to have the same impact. You know, without having to change the centralized institutions, you create autonomy and decentralization through these special jurisdictions.
Yeah,
you can try to change the world by starting a great company or building a science lab within an existing structure and institution, set of institutions, and that's great. Many people do, but I think more people should also be than they are. I think also considering trying to change things by changing the structure within other people work, within which other people do their thing. And I kind of like Airbnb comes to mind as like in a way, because there was always people who went to their other house or went away and their house was empty and they would have liked to make money off of it, and they're fine with people staying in their house. And there were always people that would have liked to stay not in a house instead of a hotel. But for decades, the house was empty, right, and the person who's in that town would stay in the hotel. And what it takes is, it took one company to say there is an invisible. Sometimes it's hard to see. There is this invisible potential here. There's supply, there's demand that they don't even realize that there's supply and demand, but they are, and we can just tie this cord and boom, giant industry, and all of the supply. Didn't realize it was supply, starts providing this thing, and all of this demand starts buying it. And so this I bring that up just because I feel like it's when I see this, it's like Honduras is sitting there, and there is this latent potential, yep, in the people, in this piece of land, in the legal structure. It is there, but it's invisible. You can just it's not obvious when you just look at Honduras 15, 20 years ago. You wouldn't say, oh, clearly there should be but it's there. If someone understands, knows where to look and realizes that this thing, and once that's what I've kind of heard from you is that it's not just the potential here, but it's what you can actually not just be starting Airbnb in one little district around, right, South by Southwest for that weekend of the year, but that's how they started South by, you do that. And then it's like, wait a second, this can be everywhere all the time. And so, you go from here, and then it's like you realize, and now there's all of this latent supply and demand in other countries. It's not invisible now because they see it here and they realize we have this here also. Yes. We have the same possibility here. And so that's what's amazing. It's a proving out a model, which of course is also the really hard part, doing the first thing and establishing it. I mean, Airbnb got rejected by 60 VCs, 60 before they finally got someone to believe in their idea, because people said, no one's going to want someone in their house. People want to stay in hotels. No one wants to do the dishes on vacation. And that was a bunch of conventional wisdom. And it turns out it was wrong. So you're dealing with that. You're dealing with you have to break the ground. So,
literally.
Yeah.
Literally. In addition to everything. Yes.
Literally.
Yeah. Yeah. And Eric, you had this great analogy, right, of looking at on the point of latent potential, right? If you take a Honduran in Honduras, they earn $3,000 per year, $4,000 per year. But if you take the same person and put them in the US, they earn 10 times as much, right? And this latent potential.
Absolutely, it's an opportunity for countries, and Honduras being the pioneer, to go from exporting their best talent, or at least the most ambitious and willing to work the hardest, who are leaving, instead of exporting that talent, importing the best practices and conditions that they're hoping to get somewhere else. It's like, well, they could have the American dream that they're hoping for, but here it could be the Honduras dream, right? Or the American dream in Honduras, if you will. And that's a very powerful idea, but it's also working in reality. And the fact that they can go and immediately, and this is not after 5 or 10 years of training, this is immediately go to the US and make 10 times more with a bunch of obstacles, lack of legal status, because this is just illegal immigrants that the report was talking about, without family, without language, without formal training. What that really tells you is that 10 times is the minimum upside, right? It could be 50 times more. And so that's very exciting.
Yeah, they don't want to go to the U.S. No one wants to leave their culture. A lot of times, many of their family members, their friends. That home, it's home, and no one wants to. I mean, very rarely do people actually want to leave home. They're doing it because there is no. It is just so much better than the options, and there's just if there is no place here, and yeah, I mean it's very inspiring, and it is it's like you said, it's not just for those people to be able to stay at home while also getting opportunity, but it's for the country. I mean, the brain drain is a real thing. If your absolute best and brightest are leaving, they're producing for another country now, right? They're now helping the U.S. grow itself, and what a shame. You know, the U.S. doesn't need that. They have plenty of people there, but you know, Honduras wants their best and brightest here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. One thing I'm often asked about, and it seems like a bit of a contradiction. You know, the roots for me of this project are very much, you know, you would say in a poverty alleviation, economic development aspiration, right? I grew up in a country that was poor, and I wanted to create the conditions at home for people to be lifted, right? And so the traditional wisdom thinks of poverty alleviation in a certain way, right? And it's not at all what this looks like, because then you come here and, you know, you see a cool dome and biotech companies and not at all the industries nor the profile of individuals that the poverty alleviation industry tends to work with, or the strategies that they follow. And so people often ask, wait, you know, what the hell? Is it this or is it that? And the point is that why does it have to be one or the other? The thing that does that the most powerful also does the other very powerfully. Like if you create conditions for the most innovative people to pursue innovation responsibly, those same conditions are the ones that enable people to start the food stand and to do their first service company, go from being a maid in a home to actually employing people and having a company with 10, 20, 30 service providers. And so, you know, because people never go deep enough to the foundation is the same. The foundation that the most radical innovators need of stability, property rights, individual liberty, responsibility is the foundation that, when it's lacking, traps people into a cycle of poverty because they have no hope. They don't have the minimum resources necessary to overcome the friction of time and cost and uncertainty of creating the first LLC. So it's actually one and the same if you dig deep enough to the foundations of what enables people to prosper at scale.
Right.
That was kind of the insight of like the Enlightenment, was that human potential is vast, but it needs the certain kind of right balance of freedom and structure in order to really flourish. You know, too much freedom and you have an anarchic society, you end up with warlords, and too much structure. I mean, you can look at North Korea and South Korea. You can look at lots of examples, but and that human potential is dampened and it's just kind of repressed. And these are all the same people, right? It was the same species that can be stuck in 50 years of poverty or building a global hub where it's everyone who lives there is basically wealthy now. It's the same human beings, and it's all about the structures and the incentive systems. And we've learned a lot. I mean, you can just look now. I mean, we know a lot more than they did a few hundred years ago. We can look at so many examples. And so I feel like sometimes it's hard to get a country that's one way to change.
You know, and you're absolutely right. This Enlightenment period, and I would say the American Revolution and the founding of the U.S. was a climatic moment. And I would argue that they got it probably exactly right or very close to right, and say that balance between individual liberty and structure and responsibility. The issue is that the way the institutions were designed were misaligned in terms of incentives. Okay, it wasn't never meant to be a democracy to begin with; it was a republic. But even that, with the interstate commerce clause and the way the federal government has just grown and grown and grown, the institutions have evolved to be so far and away what they were upon the founding of the country that they have taken over, to some extent, the dynamics that were given birth to here through the American Revolution. And so part of what we're trying to do is acknowledge that the conditions might have been exactly right. I mean, we have learned a bit more. I think people can, through econometrics and other mechanisms, really quantify the impact of economic freedom as opposed to cultural differences from one country to another. You can have a very different culture, but if you have similar degrees of economic freedom, you're going to have similar degrees of material wealth. So you can map that, but the real innovation, the real need is not just to hit the reset button and kind of delete everything and have the same incentive structure. Is how do you create institutional frameworks that are dynamic, that are responsive like a market player would be to the right amount of structure. And in some cases, you might need more structure, and in other cases, you might need less structure. The current institutions are set up in a manner that is a one-way ratchet to ever more degrees of structure or regulation and restrictions and redistributions. And there's no easy way to ever go back in a material way. I mean, I see with great sadness what happened with Doge and the limited impact that had. And this was at the hands of, I would say, the world's best, in the most friendly of administrations one could ever hope. And the impact was, I don't know what it was. I mean, it's nothing, right? Yeah. So what does that tell you? You can't really do it in that structure. So the design of the institutions is fundamental, and perhaps this is the entrepreneurship version of institutional evolution in the governance world.
Yeah. It's like people say it's easy to put up a street light if you're a politician, but it's not easy to take one down because now someone gets in a crash and it's your fault. And there's just, it's just not, removing regulations is just not, it doesn't happen. Each individual government's just not incentive. That's just not, and they might think it's good, but that's not what their voters care about. It's not what, and so there's like, I think, Elon Musk himself describes it as like the trash builds up, but there's no garbage men coming through. There's no garbage trucks. So they just you end up with this clogged streets full of trash now, but, even though it's all well-intentioned in the moment or not, but either way, it's each one is minor, but it builds up to this log jam. And I think, if you look at when, you can imagine the kind of, archaic, medieval institutions that were still, stubbornly present in Europe before the U.S. was founded, and even now, England doesn't really have free speech. I mean, you can see it's hard to, to get out of old ways. I'm sure a lot of the current ways in, Europe, which is very advanced and very progressive, I'm sure you'll still see a lot of medieval, rules in place. But the U.S. was fresh and new, and it could start with all that baggage, right? But now you said the U.S. now has its own baggage; it has its own things, and we don't have new countries to start. That's why a zone like this can be a fresh start with a lot less, of a giant country to run, and maybe one way that bigger countries can actually be and the public within those countries can wake up to, wait, we need to get rid of some regulations, or is by showing instead of just talking about it. And if something here is thriving, you're going to see now governments starting to say, okay, we need to be a little more like them.
Yeah. And the one thing that could be interesting to expand on is like how does the institutional design of Próspera differ from the US one? What did we learn from the framers, right? I mean, there's several examples, right? We have a charter cap on the amount of taxation we can do as a percentage of GDP, right? 7.5%. And so I think many developed countries are around 40% or so. And so that's kind of one key thing. What are some other things, and what were the reasons that those were designed?
I would say that the two most fundamental ones is intentional exit and profit. Those are the two main things. Because of those, the way downstream decisions have been made include like a cap rate through any coercive measures, taxes or fees, and the way in which the regulatory reciprocal system was designed so that you could externalize as many of the costs while making sure that there's effective oversight and regulation. But so there's a lot of, let's say, design decisions that are at the surface of the user experience that because we were intentional on baking into the core intentional exit and profit motive have followed. And so that exit and profit are the two things that unfortunately, and the framers of the U.S. structure did not intentionally bake in. They explicitly designed a government that depended upon the morality of those that governed, right, and of the citizenry. So that is, that can be a very strong motivator in the short term, but culture shifts over time, and if that is your check, and the culture moves away from a restrictive government, then likewise the institutions will grow, and that's what we've seen. And then the exit, they thought that by having 50, or at that point obviously less number of states, that you would have competition amongst them, but they did not bake enough exit, and thus the Interstate Commerce Clause was used to continue to centralize power at the federal government. And while you could make reforms, the collective action problem applies not just at the individual by individual, but it's exacerbated even further if you put it at the state by state level. If you need, a majority of the states to agree to make some constitutional change, then forget it. I mean, collective action is that much harder. If they had baked in an intentional, lawful, and clearly spelled out exit mechanism by which Texas could secede, if they said, look, guys, either you restrict this, or with all the expense that it would take to exit, a union and lose out on some of those network effects of shared defenses and all that. But if it was a baked-in exit without so much drama, just look, I'm exercising my option to exit. That is a huge check and power that doesn't rely this, never-ending rhetorical political debate. It's just, okay, we don't agree, exit, I go. So we observing that, we baked both powerfully into our model, right? I mean, it is a for-profit model, and therefore, your residents are your customers, and you have to provide enough, but not more, right? But also not less. Right. So you got to figure out what's the right balance, and that will evolve over time. And you got this feedback mechanism. And then on top of it, it's a sticky service. So once you live in a place, especially if you're a property owner, it's very, the transactional cost to exit in a traditional sense of you picking up and leaving is tough. So exit in our model is embedded within you. If you're a landowner, you've incorporated into a special jurisdiction without having to physically pick up and leave. You can submit a disincorporation request. And then, in Honduras, at least, you will go back to the ordinary regime, or you could go back to a competing special jurisdiction when those are set up. But the idea of exiting your service provider is what we take for granted in the market, right, but does not at all exist in the market of governance services.
Yep.
I mean, it's just, there's such clear, again, lessons in economics that are being applied here, which is, when there's a monopoly on something, you see bad services declining, services, you see things not being updated for decades, and you see corruption begin, and people, it's like bloated administrations at colleges where people are, there's so many examples where it's like or just, using the major TV providers in the U.S. I mean, just things that had no competition. They're not really within a capitalist system, even though they technically are. They function like government, like DMV, like government services, which are always pretty bad, and you'll be filling out a form that's clearly from 1985. It doesn't even have cell phone on it. It just has home phone number, so
and fax number.
Exactly. And you can just see that this is something that has had no incentive to be good or to stay good, because they automatically have their, so. And then on the other hand, when there's a company that is within the market, but it's still kind of the biggest, best known, it's going to be working hard to stay there. But when you have multiple companies, I'm happy that Android came around to push iOS, because if it was just like, well, everyone just gets an iPhone, it would be worse. But now it's like neither one can let the other one become clearly better. So they are every little tiny thing they're trying to always optimize and make it so good, and it just brings the exact right incentive and aligns them with the people. So it's especially hard to do with because people don't want to move, like you said.
Right.
So there's so many mechanisms in place with sovereignty that just crush that that incentive to be not just good, but fluid and evolving and staying good, and not having a policy from 1985 that's just still here because it doesn't make sense. And so I love it. I mean, I think again, it's the kind of thing you can do with this kind of smaller places, more nimble, brand new. There's so much opportunity here to have government function like a really sharp free market institution of a company.
Right.
And you have to continue to earn it.
Exactly.
People will leave otherwise. It's like, again, Elon always used to say, like, he's rooting for Blue Origin. He wants competition because it means that the industry's thriving and also good. Keep us honest, So I feel like you probably would feel the same way. You hope there's lots of competing ones, great, because the mission is not for you to say we want this to Prospera to be the biggest and best, and we want to win this. You just want the model to explode. So you would love competition,
Absolutely.
right? Yeah.
The biggest challenge is the paradigm, limiting paradigm that the old model is the only model, and there's no way to really innovate it. So the more serious players in the space, the more the paradigm will shift. And I think there'll be a tipping point where then it, goes from crazy, impossible, ridiculous to why did we ever think of doing it differently before, right? Like the alternative, when you look back at it, would be like, well, that was a dumb experiment, or at least it evolved to be stupid. Yeah. But it's necessary. It's part of the way everything meaningful evolves. You do the best at the time, and then you do something so much better that looking back, what was before the best was, stupid or dumb.
Yep. Yep.
I mean, when you're reasoning from first principles and building something genuinely pretty new, it's going to be full of mistakes, and that's like the sign of an original is they're going to also do some dumb things like that. That is always going to, the way to avoid dumb things is to copy something that's already works. Right. And there's a lot and endless examples of companies and other things doing that. And the ones that do disrupt, the ones that disrupt industries are the ones who are just ignoring conventional wisdom and reasoning from first principles, and taking big risks. And a lot of them fail, and a lot of them, they're rogue experimenting. But it's more fun. It's more interesting, and the ceiling is so much higher.
Right.
Yeah.
And one of the things we spoke about yesterday was, the culture wars being one of the core issues of our time, right? And, Eric was mentioning as well that, currently if Texas has a problem with the federal government, all they can do is argue, right? And so people just argue, and it ends up being into culture wars, so people just end not liking each other. Whereas if there was an easy exit mechanism, right? So people can choose what they like the best. You don't need to argue, you don't need to fight, right? You do you, I do I, and there's more harmony in that way.
And that's paradoxical. The idea that you can keep cohesion and harmony by enabling a higher degree of polarization in how people actually live without forcing it upon each other it's counterintuitive.
Yep.
Right now, the prevailing paradigm suggests that we all have to find the common denominator. Well, but the common denominator assumes that we're sufficiently alike, and because you have a multicultural population, and for good reasons with immigration and what have you, you have this inherent conflict. So actually, to keep cohesion, you need to enable polarization to occur, but peacefully, and where people can congregate with whatever structures they think are best for them. And you can't do that with a monolithic one-size-fits-all model. It's impossible, literally.
The U.S. would be way more harmonious if it were more federalist, and it was like 50 experiments, 50 governments, like. You can still be, I hate that government and how they do things. They're such bad people. That's okay.
That's okay.
That's cool. You can judge them like they're like okay, and but don't move there. You're definitely not, and if your new government comes in your state and they're doing things you don't like all right, you're free to move. And if you really hate it enough, like there's 49 other states, like pick one that works. And over time, people filter to them, and then they each develop their own little culture, and then one state does something really innovative with healthcare and they can all copy. I mean, it's
supposed to be that way, but of course the federal government has absorbed so much of where before the states were supposed to be sovereign.
Yeah.
It was supposed to be a union among sovereign, and they've become like just subjects of the federal government. The federal government does 80-90% of the regulatory structure. You go to any one jurisdiction in the US and you ask, what am I supposed to comply with? About 80% of it is directly or indirectly defined by the federal government, not the state or city's governments.
Which isn't like they're not, the federal government just isn't close enough to the people to even. It doesn't make sense, and but it's like it's hard to go backwards once you do this. And I think you also see a cultural aspect that is also doing that is kind of going along with this, maybe partially because of it, but I think also as a separate phenomenon, which is, if you went back to the 1950s in the U.S., you saw there were different realms of politics, different layers, and there was the local, local politics, like what's going on in my district, in my neighborhood, and what's happening here. And people would go to their town hall meetings and whatever. And then there was, the state politics. There was kind of the Republicans versus Democrats in Kansas might be totally different than what the Republican and Democrat means in Massachusetts. Like, it's just that they were names. They all had the same names, but the parties had their own thing going on, right? In some cases, the Democrats were farther, more conservative than the Republicans in a different state. It was just whatever. And then there was the national politics, right? The president, the left and right, versus right in the national politics. And then there was international. There was a lot of focus on the Soviet Union, and first World War II and the Soviet Union, and it was this idea that on an even higher level we have this major conflict going on. So there was a lot of conflict, but it was spread out vertically.
Right.
There was some people were focused on this, which made them really the top conflict maybe brought in some xenophobia that might have been ugly, but it also brought in patriotism, which was a unifying thing. The national party, was more, brought in national division, but also maybe made people, focus less on hating the enemy because they were now concerned with, And then the local politics was actually, if you look at, because they're, again, in Congress, the Republicans also, they disagreed with each other. There were factions within the Republicans that hated each other more than either of them hated the Democrats. And so that brought it simmered the national thing, right? Because if you're focused on, you really hate your fellow Democrat who, faction, you're actually both gonna, you're just gonna chill out on your anti-Republican. So what happened is, for a bunch of reasons, the international thing simmered because the Soviet Union became less powerful, and so people stopped focusing on that. And then you had a bunch of the conservative Democrats all kind of became Republicans. The liberal Republicans kind of became Democrats, and it really became these two more monolithic groups. So there was less inter-party faction, and then you ended up with everything focused on this left versus right nationally. And then you have social media coming along, and it just, all these people that would normally be, throwing a fit about their HOA, rules and, something, all that kind of political energy, just everything gets focused on this national thing. And so you end up with, now you have, that brings out, when there's one conflict, full tribalism and just hatred, real, dehumanizing hatred of the other. They're the worst people. They're not even human. Right. I hope they die. I mean, that's how a lot of Americans think. They are the most dangerous, awful people in history. I mean, that's a product of, there's no distribution of the conflict. It's all concentrated. So this is a little off topic, but it just reminded me because then, when you talk about the intercommerce, the interstate commerce and those rules, you also just have the country now, instead of focusing in on what's going on locally in their state. They're just all concerned with the national politics. And you will actually have, there's examples of, a certain act is passed by a Democrat president, and you'll have, Republican Congress and governors that vote against it, even though it would actually be very good for their constituents. Because in their constituents are okay with that, because it's like we're all just concerned with hating the bad guys. And you can just see how ugly this gets and how out of hand. And it's just so far removed from what we want here, which is, again, when you spread it out and you just have, it's a diversion, but it just reminds me of how troubled the U.S. is right now, and how I like fresh starts other places. Because the U.S. is still, worldwide is one of the best examples of a country that does work in a lot of ways, but we can do so much better.
Well, perhaps we can. I mean, I think there are examples, and earlier I was speaking about Zipline as a drone company that couldn't launch successfully in the US. They did so abroad. They proved the model, and then they brought it back home. And now they're one of the largest, most successful drone logistics companies. We started in the U.S. before we ever started working in Honduras. We were working in Arizona with the governor at the time, Doug Ducey. We developed the enabling legislation and the rule sets that would, if enacted, enable something even more powerful than what is happening here in Honduras and other countries are considering to happen within the constitutional order of the U.S. using the interstate compact clause. And so, it's a bit of a wet dream or long-term possibility. Maybe it's a moonshot, if you will. But I still remain very inspired by the possibility of the U.S. going back to its roots, to the root itself of true federalism, where the American entrepreneur is unleashed with all of the infrastructure that has been built up over time at every level, but also the entrepreneurial culture that is uniquely American. I mean, imagine what would be possible for the world if we were to actually unleash the entrepreneurial potential in the U.S. And this, I think, it's a powerful tool that is proving itself elsewhere, has a history of success. And I think if the stars aligned and we can all get a little lucky, the U.S. might actually leapfrog further ahead than it could have ever hoped to be, say, 5-10 years from now.
How would that work exactly? So what would happen in the U.S. that would bring this to the U.S.? Like, what would that look like?
So the legal instrumentality that would enable essentially local jurisdictions or state and sub-state to absorb much of what the federal government has usurped through the interstate commerce clause is done through an interstate compact. States are sovereign per the Constitution. They can enter into agreements with each other to form interstate compacts that exist above the state line, and if consented to by Congress, also above federal law. So they say the New York, New Jersey Port Authority, that exists above both New Jersey and New York and has powers that even the federal Transportation Administration can't override. So you can create institutional frameworks that exist at a higher level of authority, but then by so doing, localize the space for policy setting. So we've developed the model legislation. You need at least 2 states to enter into a compact, but you can have as many states join it as they want. And then the key hook is you need congressional consent. And so that consent is the one that is politically more tricky, but actually the federal government has consented to interstate compacts all the time. There's over 200 of them. And we will argue that there is pre-existing advanced consent to various regulatory reform needs that were envisioned to be possible via compact, but have not yet been enacted. So
we talk about invisible potential. I mean, the U.S. actually is a country that has more potential than a much older country because it has these rules and these, and it's, the complicated mess of rules actually can work in its favor. And I bet you that honestly, a bunch of politicians that are currently in office don't even really know that that's possible because they're just. If it's not a topic, people just don't even know. And I bet you American citizens really don't know. So it would take a very someone who's already really interested in this and does know and has this dream like you do, to kind of get in power in a state and make it a campaign and find a way to sell it to make it to sell it to their constituency, and then it could become a huge story. And then again, once it does, now it could be suddenly copied.
Look, I think it's taken a team such as ours that is very niche and passionate to discover and then build upon the instrument, the tool that would unleash this in the U.S. But then it takes a spectrum of people, everything from, say, the Mark Andreessens, that by capital, but also gravitas in the business world can bring that perspective. And it might be the one moment in time where somebody like Donald Trump on the White House is just bold enough, crazy enough to say, yeah, we're going to do big things. So part of me intuitively, maybe even with some degree of faith-based way of looking at the world, thinks that everything that has been happening over the last decade was perfect the way it had to happen so as to get to this moment. And this moment is, a couple years in duration. So I must admit publicly, I have a high degree of faith that in the US, there's something big that's about to happen, and that we've been fortunate to help develop that thing that might unlock it. And with perhaps conversations like this and individuals that can come and see firsthand and then dig deep, do the due diligence and sort of realize, holy crap, there's this, trapped potential, but it is possible and it's realistic and it's, for all the right reasons that when enough of these individuals come together, all the conditions are set for it to actually happen.
Yeah, totally. I think people, when potential's been trapped for a while, people can just forget that it's there, right. And they think that they're already at their ceiling. An example of something that can break through makes people realize, wait a second, we can do better.
Yep.
Yeah.
And maybe we can, just for the audience as well, like in terms of what is currently, what do we have to show for as of today, right? Here in Roatan, right? Because if we're going to the US and you want to do interstate compacts in the US, they will say, okay, what have you produced so far in Roatan, right? And so maybe you could talk a little bit about your view of what are the main things that has been achieved here so far. What are the main things that we hope to achieve in the coming year, 2 years?
Sure. Well, let me just, for this particular audience, and then we might, if you go to Blueprint for America, and then the passcode to open it is reindustrialize, you'll be able to see the full explanation of what I just mentioned, the legal framework so as to unleash this in the US with obviously orders of magnitude more potential than anywhere else in the world. But Lonis, maybe actually we can ping pong with each other the sorts of things that have been going on the ground that are, let's say, proofs of what can happen. And before I start, what are the things that most recently you considered to be big successes?
Yeah, well, we're sitting in the podcast studio. We didn't have this 3 months ago, right?
Yeah.
So that's something. That's something.
Okay, fair enough.
I think when I moved here, 1.5 years ago, we were maybe 100 people here. Now we're maybe close to 200 people, right? So we're growing in size very quickly, and at this point, we're just bottlenecked by the number of housing available. So we are growing very nicely there. When I joined, I think we were like 250 companies incorporated. Now we're closer to 500 companies. And that is, by the way, whilst dealing with one of the worst administrations in Latin America, right, after Venezuela and Cuba. And so it hasn't been easy, right? But even in that context, we're able to grow very quickly. And so that's been very exciting. Obviously, we have a few kind of strategic initiatives around building out more biotech and longevity infrastructure. We think we're close to becoming a hotspot, especially as AI starts to design better and better drugs. Right, so we'll have miracle drugs curing all sorts of diseases soon using AI. However, the traditional regulatory agencies are not set up to function differently just because the drug design process becomes more effective. So a jurisdiction like ours can be a vehicle for people to get access to treatments for their specific diseases. Right, if there's niche diseases, big pharma doesn't have an incentive to care about it, and the economics don't make sense. Here it can make sense. And so I think that is very exciting, and I think that will happen in the coming year, that will be able to really take that type of place. You can also just look at, I guess, high-level numbers. I think Jorge, the local mayor of Prospera, he published numbers saying that we generated around 3,000 local jobs last year. I guess that's counting direct and indirect jobs, right? The direct jobs having at least 25% higher wage than the national average. And then, of course, all the supporting industries that creates. And I think that is quite cool numbers, just given the context as well of having the previous government being against. And so, yeah, I guess those would be some high levels.
Yeah, I guess we have some LOIs, MOUs that we've recently signed that perhaps we're not ready to talk about publicly. But I can say that whereas, when we started, we had a whole bunch of interest by, big companies and startups. But with the political environment, it was just the startups that said, that stayed basically, right? And then it's been 4 years. We're starting to get back up some of those larger corporate partners looking at nearshoring operations and other types of big opportunities. Of course, in alignment with geopolitical trends as well, of nearshoring back to the hemisphere and strengthening supply chains. But I take those signs of indications and commitments to build here starting early next year is a really powerful sign of transcending what historically had been considered impossible,
Right.
then just for startups. And now, frankly, the bigger players are the ones that nominally have the most to win.
Right. Tim, what do you think we should, you haven't been here quite, not for such a long time, but based on what you're currently seeing, what do you think are, areas that we should focus more on, that people don't know about, that we should do a better job of telling people about? What is your high level view?
I mean, I think it's biotech is the absolute first thing I would say. And that's obviously very much happening here because it's such an exciting time in biotech. It's, I talked to much of biologists. People call it the golden age of biology. We're really in the early stages of right now with all the new AI-enabled, programmable medicine and, gene editing and epigenetic reprogramming. And there's just a lot of like crazy new technologies that are, it's almost like, I feel like the invention of the integrated circuit, the transistor and the integrated circuit come out. And
Right.
the real effect of that, those were in the 50s, those were invented. But it was, in the 80s and 90s that the personal computers went all over the world, that you could suddenly see, oh my God, this really changed the world. It changed the world and it changed industries before that and it changed companies, but then it really.
Right.
So I feel like, CRISPR is the transistor or whatever,
Yes.
and Yamanaka factors and the discovery of being able to kind of revert any cell to a stem cell, that kind of basic technology of using transcription factors to change the identity or the age of a cell. That is like, these are these core new capabilities that then a million companies and medicines will be built upon. And we're still coming just beginning to understand the possibilities. That the actual medicine is yet to come in most cases, and treatments. So, given that, I mean, but there is an 800-pound, dinosaur
Sure.
that slows everything down, the FDA, and it's a well-intentioned thing. We don't want no FDA. I don't want to go to the store and buy a headache medicine that might actually kill me
Right.
because they don't know what they're doing. This company, we need the FDA. But and I'm not an expert on it. I've never had to deal with the FDA myself. I've just talked to lots of biologists, and again, regulations come up as really slows us down.
Yep.
It really makes it hard for us to get funding for really bold things. So they end up doing less bold things. And if someone wants to work on lifespan, can't really say that. Can't really say that out loud. You will not get really hard to get grants, but you can say you're working on health span, which we want too. That's great, but we would like to also be taking the moonshots. So I see biotech as the perfect match for, and it's the perfect timing. There's going to be, this is just the beginning of kind of you're not even going to believe the kind of crazy companies and moonshots and medicines that are going to be coming here. Embryology, and there's people working on artificial wombs and being able to, edit embryos. And there's going to be lots of laws and red tape to get through to try to, do some things that could be life-saving. So, I mean, I guess it's a boring answer because you're already doing it's already here. But I just think it's so perfect for that. And again, it's. I think what you'll find is things will start to probably gravitate here that really can benefit from it most. Because if it can be done 90% as well in San Francisco, probably they won't be coming here to do it. But if it can be done 20% as well in San Francisco or in anywhere else in MIT, then this could be a real
Right.
landing spot.
Yeah, and what's interesting with biotech and drugs in general is that it produces this invisible graveyard, right, of people that could be saved, right?
Yeah.
If the structure was there, but they aren't, right? And so it's a hard thing for the common man to kind of rail against the FDA because they don't know what they're missing. It's an invisible graveyard it's producing rather than a visible one. But as you say, more and more, especially the scientists, are kind of waking up to it. And whereas when we started, maybe it was less understood. Now more and more scientists are understanding it and are very much open to this concept.
Yeah, it's both companies to develop things and it's people who need things that they have 2 months left to live, and the thing is not approved yet, but it's proven to be safe. It's just not efficacy trials or whatever. Something is, so it will save a lot of lives. I mean, I don't know. What other industries do you think that you think could benefit from?
Well, I think agentic commerce is a niche right now that is slowed down massively by legacy institutions, and we're actively looking how we might be able to support and accelerate that process.
Agentic commerce meaning what?
Well, how does AI engage in commercial activity of trade? With personhood, legal or otherwise.
Right.
There's all this potential there, but how do you inject it into the economy directly? Not, ChatGPT is fine. Like enabling humans to be more productive is fantastic, but these things could be doing things behind the scenes directly, through contractual relationships and otherwise. And the legal infrastructure still doesn't have a clue how it's going to evolve for that. Imagine how long it took to have the first DAO-compatible legal entity in Wyoming after crypto had been around for a while. I think this is even more complicated than that because of issues of common law, of liability, assignment to individuals with agency. But it's all designed around humans. Once AI is considered to, and I would argue in many ways it already has agency, but we're not far from that. Do we just ignore it? Do we have no frameworks for it to engage? And if they are going to engage, are the humans or the companies that invented these AIs the ones responsible, as if it had been a car that they manufactured, even though cars don't have agencies, but AI does? I think it's a fantastic philosophical issue, but then we're going to have to react quickly legally to create the frameworks that prove out how it can be done for the better and then spread out. In fact, don't we have a summit coming up for that?
Yeah, I mean, we're working on a summit either by late April or early May, where we'll try to get the world's best scientists and AI ethicists and researchers together and try to figure out what should the structure be, because obviously it's coming. Everyone in AI knows that agents will take part of the economy in a substantial way, but there's no real good foresight in terms of how do we regulate it in a safe way, like in a human-centric way, whilst also allowing for economic growth. And we have some ideas. We have a study we drafted. We had some good feedback from industry leaders, but want to get more feedback, right? And so,
right. And then there's also the ideas, which a lot of people have been talking about. But just like there are great ideas for how to empower biotech to move at the speed of latest technologies, sometimes the ideas are it's a prerequisite, which we want to click further into. But then the institutional molasses that gets in the way of those ideas being implemented is where I think we can really create an opportunity here.
I mean, it's also just, this is not, 1850 or 1950. The speed at which things are moving right now and changing, it really requires institutions that can absorb the speed and can change with it, that are fluid and nimble.
Right.
And you can't have these old processes that are slow that's going to work for something that is going so quickly. And it's a real problem. I mean, that's I think some of our biggest AI, danger, related danger, is just the slowness at which regulations are passed, or that even information can really filter through government minds. I mean, it's just very, very slow, and that's kind of intentional. It's supposed to go slow, and that's great in 1782. But there has to be a mechanism to move faster. So again, this is a place where, I think you can make progress on AI safety in a way that could then become an example that could then filter to be an example that we need.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. So commerce is one thing. I guess we are looking to build out potentially an AI data center on the mainland, right? So
cool.
We aiming for maybe 50 to 100 megawatts, right? So not a huge one, but still you can do some inference in Central America. As you know, if you want to build a data center in the US, it can 3-year environmental review. In Europe, it's impossible essentially, and it's quite important for several reasons. But it's good to have AI data centers being spread out even in developing countries, right? Because if you think of a future where all of the AI workload is controlled by 2 countries, that's not really great, right? It's good to have diversity of AI compute, and so if you can bring it to a country like Honduras, I think that would be a great thing for many purposes. So I guess that's, and then the third one I would be, I guess, nearshoring or manufacturing, traditional.
Yeah, a bit more traditional, but Honduras has so much pent up demand. I think Honduras has an industrial base, and employs around 500,000 individuals, and it's mostly textiles, basic industries. But we see a world in which the industrial base can grow 50x to 100x in installed capacity, with the human component maybe growing 10x, right? With the difference being automation, basically. And so, you can have people going from making garments to serving, maintaining, and overseeing a lot of these industrial infrastructures, whether it is maintaining robots or the data centers. I mean, there's a lot of talent here that has a cost advantage vis-a-vis the US, and then the regulatory environment can help accelerate that adoption of newer technologies while becoming increasingly relevant commercial partner, in the hemisphere.
Yeah, and we already see that a little bit with the circular factory, right? Yeah. Which I'm not sure if you've seen it yet. It's the building right behind us.
It's the one that is distinctively not circular, but very sharp-edged. Okay. It's the most sharp-edged building on the jurisdiction.
Yeah. But there, we have 25 or 30 people from the local community from Crawfish, right? And many of them haven't been taught, because of how the educational system is here, they haven't been taught how to read and write. So they communicate mostly via voice notes on WhatsApp, right? So they send voice notes back and forth. But regardless of this, they've been able to, on the job, learn how to program robotics in a quite interesting way, right? So they've been able to leapfrog to some extent, right? And we should be able to see that at a larger scale in La Ceiba as well.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's super exciting. It just feels like I like the place where it's like anything's possible. Like if you have an idea, it's like, let's do it. Let's make it happen. If a new industry pops up in the world that surprises everyone, okay, let's start. Let's bring it here. I mean,
right.
And just when you have, like you said, an AI data center, it's like, well, what are the things that can be done way better with the data center here than in the US? Because again, if no one's going to come here if it's the same.
Of course.
No.
But there are going to be places where it's like, you can't do that in the US, but we really should be. We have a data center here. Come do it here.
Right.
Just like you have a clinical trials thing here. Come do it here, right? You're kind of setting up you almost don't even need to know what it'll be used for yet. You're building this so that if there's something where we really need to get around US, red tape for something important, like we're ready. You're ready for it, and it's great.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, that's great, and hopefully we'll be able to have much more to show in a year or two as well. But this has been a great first episode of whatever we decide to call it. If you have thoughts on what we should call it, please leave it in the comments. Otherwise, I'll just ask AI to figure it out.
It'll give you 20 ideas.
Yeah, it will give me 20 ideas. Yeah.
I'll be a viewer, listener of the podcast from here on. So
perfect. Well, thanks so much for joining.
Yeah, thanks for hosting.
All right.
Thank you.